Greetings. My name is Marcia Eli. I can no longer say Marcia Eli of the Brooklyn Historical Society because as of today, literally today, Brooklyn Historical Society is the new Center for Brooklyn History at the Brooklyn Public Library. So I'm Marcia Eli of the Center for Brooklyn History. I wanted to welcome you all and say that for those of you who have enjoyed over the years the public programs, at the former BHS, we will keep presenting weekly discussions about the issues of our times and the history that needs to be told more fully. And I hope you keep joining us. Visit our programs page at the now Center for Brooklyn History website at brooklynhistory.org to see what's coming up. So it is such a pleasure to be partnering with the Brooklyn Book Festival on this conversation, Jim Crow, New York, the long history of Yankee racism. I have unfortunate news that one of our speakers, Brian Purnell, had a sudden family emergency this morning, and so will not be with us today. So it's my pleasure to introduce two scholars who have done an enormous amount of work to correct a misguided narrative about racism in the North. I urge you to buy their books by clicking on the Buy Book button on the bottom of the screen, and books will also continue to be for sale on the festival website afterwards. So now it is my pleasure to tell you about this afternoon's speakers. Clarence Taylor is Professor Emeritus of History at Baruch College, CUNY, and author of multiple books, including African Americans and the Long History of Police Brutality in New York City. And Jeanne Theoharis is Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College and the author or co-author of 9 books on the civil rights and Black Power movements, on the politics of race and education, and social welfare and civil rights in post 9/11 America. Some of her books include The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, and A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights. So with that, I will disappear and say welcome, Clarence and Jeanne, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be here, and I think we all sort of begin with the idea, right, that history helps us see the present differently, that we cannot see clearly where we are today in the city, where we are today in terms of a growing conversation about law enforcement without looking at the past. And so, Clarence, I wanted us to start off with one story. And again, just like Marcia just said, if you have not read Clarence's book, Fight the Power, African Americans and the Long History of Police Brutality in New York City, you need to. And particularly, I think we're going to be, as we're going to see today, right, to understand where we are in this country, in a kind of growing movement around sort of criminal justice, around policing. I think we have to know this history. So Clarence, start us off with some story about the struggle in New York City around police violence that helps us see and know something about where we are today in the city.
Sure. It's glad to be here. I'm very happy to be here with you, Jeanne, to discuss the civil rights in New York and, of course, in the North. The story of police brutality is a long history since the creation of police departments, right? Professional police departments. And clearly by the 1930s and 1940s, as Black communities grew in New York City, they had to deal with this police violence, which was essentially an arm of the state, right? State violence. And African Americans were targeted right from the beginning of professional policing. But the important part of that story is how the African Americans organized to confront police brutality. So we see this throughout the 1930s, 1940s, and so on. So one important story that comes to mind is the one in 1964, where you have the Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant rebellion. After a 15-year-old, James Powell, a junior high school student, was shot and killed by an off-duty police officer. The police officer then, of course, lied and said that the young man had a weapon, despite the fact that this police officer was much stronger, much bigger, heavier to confront this child. But people began to organize to take on this sort of and protest this killing. And eventually, there was a confrontation with the police. And by a few days after the killing, which did not take place in Harlem, but in Upper Manhattan, the folks began to organize, and then you had this sort of uprising. People were clearly frustrated with the way the police were treating them when they were protesting. And it was a vicious event on the part of the police. That incident, the incident, the rebellion took place for days in Harlem, and the police tried to crush it using overwhelming force. And one day they ran out of bullets because they had shot so many bullets, and they had to wait for a truck to come in so they could reload. So it was essentially a vicious way of trying to stop people from rebelling against police, or essentially state violence. Now, what came out of that was the call for some way of reducing police power and enhancing power of citizens. And the major tool that people focused on then was essentially a civilian complaints review board. Now, the Congress of Racial Equality and other civil rights groups and activists met when they said civilian complaint review board, essentially having
Civilians.
the right, that's right, having
like the civilians, yeah.
That's right, having civilians on that board, only civilians, not police officers, like the one that was in existence from 1953 on, which consisted of 3 deputy commissioners, no civilians, right? I guess both of the civilian complaint review board because they gave civilians the opportunity to come and complain to them, right? But obviously the violence continued and people weren't going for this. And so you have this tremendous battle where more and more even elected officials, you know, and city council said, well, you know, maybe we should really take this seriously and create a civilian complaint review board. Now, the end result, of course, was a Republican mayor who was a liberal, promising to create a civilian complaint review board. Now, understand the mayor before him, Mayor Robert Wagner, who was known for his liberalism, refused to have any discussion on this. It was a non-starter. But so it took a Republican liberal mayor to come in and say, well, I'll give you a moderate civilian complaint review board. And his proposal was, you know, 3 police officers, 4 civilians. They can do, they can investigate, they can make recommendations, but in the end, it's clearly the police department, the commissioner who's going to make the final decision.
Just, I want us to pause there just to say that one more time. It's how many police officers and how many civilians. This is not an all civilian CCRB that
That's
Lindsay
right.
proposes, right?
That's right. It's 4 civilians, 3 police officers, but still the final decision, if they found the officers guilty, that would be left to the police commissioner. The police department would make the final decision.
Right. And then what happens?
Well, that was too much for the police. And what was then called the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, we call it today the Police Benevolent Association, that's what they call themselves today, said, no way in the world are we going to give up our power. And they launched one of the most racist, vicious campaigns in modern New York City history in order to destroy what they call the Lindsay Commission. And what they did was they used the courts, they used advertisement, right? And of course they used the protests. They were out on the streets protesting. And the head of the PBA, a guy named John Cassess, said, we will spend, if we have to, $1 million in order to stop this. And that essentially was their complete funding, in 1966. And they did. They took out ads, and one was so racist that even the liberals in New York City who were supportive of the police would say, whoa, this guy's really over the top. And that was showing a young white woman coming out of a subway station late at night, and clearly implying that it's saying that if we keep this Civilian Complaint Review Board in existence, we will not be able to protect her, sending the message. And because they used their force to their numbers to get a referendum on the ballot after Lindsay created the Civilian Complaint Review Board, and New York is overwhelmingly 1966 through on racial lines, voted against the Civilian Complaint Review Board. So they shot it down. And when you look at the results, overwhelmingly whites voted against the Civilian Complaint Review Board, while Black and brown people voted in favor of it. Now, this is an important moment in New York civil rights history when it comes to policing, because the police not only held on to their police power, but they gained an enormous amount of political power. And they did that by pushing that sort of false narrative that if those folks attempt to take away our power, essentially what you are doing, if you allow them to do it, talking to white New York, if you allow them to do it, what you are essentially going to do is turn over the city to criminals. And criminals meaning Black and Latino folks. And that narrative was an important one because they have been using that one ever since '66. So even today, we hear this nonsense every time you challenge police power. And they usually win. If you look at the current mayor who came in as a police reformer, right? He was going to take all these actions until the PBA turned on him. And we saw this after the 2 police officers were shot and killed by a deranged person. He went to their funeral, they booed him. The head of the PBA said, the mayor has blood on his hands. And DeBlasio did an about face. So every time you see this guy, he's sort of defending the police instead of really taking strong action to sort of curb their power. So yeah, so that's a story that when I was doing this research sort of jumped at me, and I said, "Wow!" And we see the results today.
Right, right. And just to make sure people understand how fast it was. Lindsay's elected when he proposes.
Yeah, 65, he's elected, right?
Right, right. I mean, this CCRB doesn't last even a year, right? Like how
That's
fast they mobilize. And I think similarly, this is the point you're making about DeBlasio, right? Like in both these moments, we see kind of organized police union sending a message that there will be no change, right? Like that any change will be quickly and swiftly like organized against, right? And that
that's
it sends a very decisive message.
right.
Um,
But at the key of that though is race.
Absolutely.
Right. So by essentially scaring people, pushing the message like Cassese did in 65, right? In 66. He just came on and said that essentially what Lindsay is going to do is he's bowing to the whims of Blacks and Puerto Ricans. And he just was blunt about what was going on. And while Lynch is careful not to use that language today, it is inferred, right? When you talk about criminals and so forth.
Right.
And the lies that they tell, essentially reform bail leading to all these crimes in the city and so forth, which they have no evidence for.
Right, right. So the panel today, right, is called Jim Crow New York, right, which is the phrase that I think some people might find surprising. And I think what this history that you started to tell us, I think, takes us in a very different direction from the way that New York tends to portray itself and its racial politics, its liberalism, its multiculturalism, its openness, right? And then this idea of a Jim Crow New York sits very different from that. And so maybe you could tease out a little bit sort of what it, why are we calling this panel Jim Crow New York? And how does this history you've just told us about attempts to kind of reform the police and the backlash, the racial backlash against that, the white racial backlash against that, reshape our notion, right, of the city and its liberalism?
Yeah, you're right. This is the image that New York has portrayed. Many people who are outside of the city always want to come in, and they think it's this wonderful cultural melting pot. I mean, there are aspects of it. Sure, if you have money, it's fine. But what's missing is the massive inequality, and usually that's on racial lines in the city. The mistreatment, as I noted, the brutality that continues with policing, the sort of miseducation, the segregation of public schools in New York City, and the lack of funding to those schools that are predominantly Black and Latino. And this has a long history. I mean, people on the ground in Bed-Stuy and Harlem and Brownsville knew this all along. And so while this image is being presented of New York, folks are sort of challenging the reality. So yeah, your work, my work, Brian's work, and others are now sort of trying to open this up, because when they talk about civil rights, it's always, the major narrative is focusing on the Southern aspect of the civil rights movement. I was watching John Lewis, Good Trouble yesterday, and I mean, wonderful documentary, wonderful person. But there's a bigger story to tell. We're going to educate folks on what's taking place. The school system is something you and I have written on, and it's just absolutely an amazing struggle that takes place to break down segregation in the largest school system in the country. And lots of folks are surprised to find out that the largest civil rights demonstration took place in New York City. It didn't take place in Alabama. It didn't take place in Selma, Alabama. It didn't take place in Georgia. It took place here in New York City. And when I say that, people are sort of astounded by that, really,
Well,
yeah.
tell us about that. Tell us about, right. Tell us
Yeah.
about the school boycott and what leads to it and what it means that we don't know it, right? Because, right, if you ask people what the largest civil rights demonstration of the 60s, people are going to say the March on Washington, right?
Right. That's right. About 250,000 people showed up, right?
Right. This is twice that, right?
I'm sorry?
The New York school boycott in February 1964
right.
is almost twice that. Yeah. So tell us that story.
Yeah, well, that story begins in the 1930s and 1940s. Right, when parents and other activists are organizing to take on the racism of the New York City Board of Education, which segregated Black students. They gave them, the schools were like the worst facilities. They were the oldest school buildings in the city. They had the least experienced teachers teaching out of license. The complaint goes back to the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. And they harshly punished Black and Latino students, more so than white students. That's something that sort of needs to be discovered. I mean, to talked about, how Black and brown students were treated by teachers and administrators. And so people organized to stop this, this racial assault. And they did this in many ways by forming school councils, working with the progressive New York City Teachers Union, not the union that exists today, but the original union, which by the mid-1930s is taken over by members of the American Communist Party. And they lay out an agenda: get rid of the racist textbooks and biased textbooks that are essentially dehumanizing Black and brown children, right? Hire more Black teachers, teach Black history.
Wait, before we get to the Black history, I think this is one thing people don't know, right? Which is that I think sometimes we have this sense of what segregated schools look like before Brown, right? Is that I think we have this very Southern view, right? Where it's like Black teachers teaching Black students. Right. And that's not what's happening here. And I think
That's right. That's right. Because there were practically no Black teachers in the New York City school system.
No Latino teachers, right?
That's right. No, that's right. The numbers were just, minuscule. And when the New York City Teachers Union, this progressive union, pushed the Board of Education to come out and tell us who's working, tell us about your professional staff, let's hire more Black and brown teachers. The board's response was, hey, we only hire by merit. We don't keep those numbers. Not important. So it took the teachers union to conduct surveys, to go into the schools and find out how many Black and brown teachers were in the system. And what they found out was just absolutely disgraceful. By the 1950s, you had 4.5% of teachers who were Black and brown teachers. And half of those were teaching on temporary licenses. So those with regular licenses were about 2.5%. And so this became a major issue for people in Black communities and, of course, the teachers union. Now, segregation, of course, was also a major problem. Black and brown children were segregated in schools, and this was done deliberately. It wasn't something that was by accident. The superintendent, they called the head of the Board of Education, not the chancellor, but the superintendent. The superintendent would say, well, that's because of neighborhoods. We have a neighborhood choice. Kids can go to schools in their neighborhoods. The neighborhoods are segregated, so the school's going to be segregated. But activists found that even when children live near each other, they were zoned to different schools. So it was a deliberate policy on the part of the New York City Board of Education. So people began to organize, in particular around this person by the name of Milton A. Glamerson, who was the pastor of the largest Black Presbyterian church in the nation, Siloam Presbyterian Church in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And he became the leader of this movement, but it wasn't just Glamerson himself. I mean, he had to rely on activists on the ground, people in the parent-teachers associations. And they created something known as the Parents Workshop for Equality in New York City schools. And it's this group that starts launching boycotts. And when the other civil rights organizations, more mainstream civil rights organizations, saw what was taking place, they said, all right, well, I guess we better jump on the bandwagon. And so they worked with Glamerson, and they formed an umbrella organization, Committee on Integrated Schools, and then they planned a citywide boycott of the New York City public schools in order to force the Board of Education to come up with a plan and a timetable to integrate New York City schools. And so 1964 is when February 3rd, 1964 is when they launched this one-day boycott. And they kept close to 500,000 children out of the schools to force the board, I said, to come up with a timetable and a plan to integrate schools. This was the largest civil rights demonstration, by far the largest one in the nation.
So there's a lot of things I want us to talk about in terms of that. I think the first thing would be, let's go back a few years, right? Let's go back to sort of what New York City's response to Brown is, right? Which is, yay, it's a great decision, but we really don't know how it applies to us, right? And then you have people that
by the way, they also issued a statement after the Brown decision saying that we support it.
We do support it. We just don't think it has to do with us. And you have two people that we're more familiar with, right? In terms of the Southern struggle, and in terms of Brown, right? Being Kenneth Clark and Ella Baker saying, well, no, it does apply to you. You began to see kind of mounting criticism. And so the board makes its own, in a typical kind of Northern way, they say, we don't know this applies to us. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to form a committee. We'll have a commission. We'll form a commission. We'll study. We'll see what it has to do with us. If there's anything that we've done that, needs to change, right? And so they form this commission on integration, and they put Baker and Clark on it, right? Strategically hoping to quiet them down. And then so tell us about the commission, what happens, and then what the board does in response.
Sure. There were several subcommissions, subcommittees. And the most, I guess, explosive one was dealing with the professional staff.
Right.
And this subcommittee recommended, because it found that many of the schools in Harlem, Bed-Stuy, Brownsville had the least experienced teachers in the school. Not only that, students were being denied a full day of instruction in those communities.
Why?
Because there were teacher shortages, there's overcrowding, right? They didn't have enough space. So kids are winding up, instead of this 6 hours and 20 minutes that all other kids were receiving, these kids were getting sometimes less than 4 hours a day. And they had teachers who were out of license. So you have music teachers teaching math. And so, this is going to add up to a disaster. So in 1956, when the subcommittee made the recommendation that we transfer and have an involuntary transfer plan, take the experienced teachers who have been in the system for years, and reassign them to schools in Harlem and Bed-Stuy, and so on, to solve this problem of the least experienced teachers and the teacher shortage. The Teachers Guild, which was formed in 1935 in opposition to the Progressive Teachers Union, stood up and says, absolutely not. We are going to oppose this. The head of the Teachers Guild was a man by the name of Charles Coogan, who wrote an article that said, integration, yes, forced transfers, no. And he went on with this long explanation that the problem really isn't segregation. The problem is essentially kids who are unruly, and some of them bordering on criminality. And this is what we have to address. And of course, they put pressure on the New York City Board of Education, and the Board of Education rejected the recommendation of its own subcommittee and came up with a voluntary transfer proposal, and then paying teachers an extra couple $100 a year if they volunteer to do it. Because practically no one took the board up on that offer. And so it just continued.
Right. And similarly with the subcommission on zoning, right? We have Baker also on that. And they're come back and saying, yes, you are responsible. And the way to sort of change and make New York City schools more equitable is by rezoning. And similarly, like with the teacher placement. So the board's own commission comes back saying, yes, there are things you need to do. This is a problem. And then the board rejects its own commission's proposals.
That's right. And the one on the professional staff, I think what's important is with the guild's position on, quote, behavior problems.
Right. And
so when we talk about disciplining students, this becomes a union issue. And so, they push the board to, quote, protect teachers, take greater steps to make sure that we have unruly, we deal with unruly kids. Don't deal with structural inequality, right? Let's not talk about the racism in the system, but this is the way we sort of do it.
Right. And I think this is where, I think when we're using this frame of a Jim Crow New York, partly what we're saying is there are policies, there are practices that the state is employing, defending, maintaining. That does not mean that the discourses that are covering those up, that are justifying those, are exactly the same as the Jim Crow South, right? And I think one of the things you're pointing to is one of the ways that these practices get defended in New York City is by what I would call culture of poverty ideas, by these ideas that these kids are the problem, they're criminal, or even if they're not criminal, they're culturally deprived. And so what has to happen is the kids have to be improved, not the structures of schooling, right?
Yes.
And so that becomes one of the ways that you see New Yorkers defending a segregated system, but doing so in a way that can still make them, because they're still saying we're not racist. Again, like you said, with the guild precedent, integration, yes, forced transfers, no, right? So there's this constant, like, we're not racist, but we're not about to do anything.
Right. They attempt to sort of redefine what's going on here. Let's not talk about race, but you are correct. This is talking about the culture of poverty before that phrase is used in the 1960s, right?
Right.
We're talking about the 1950s and so forth. And what you have here is this really a development of resentment and anger among Black parents. It's pretty clear to them. They said, these folks just don't want to educate our children.
Right.
And so when they jump to the 1960s and they talk about the struggle over community control, because parents say, you know, enough of attempting to get the New York City Board of Education and other powerful organizations like the United Federation of Teachers to jump on board and, you know, do the right thing. They said, you know what, we have to make sure that we save the lives of our children.
Right, right.
Right.
Which can, I mean, I think if we look at the aftermath of the school boycott, I mean, I want us to talk about a few things. The first is, what's the New York Times response to the February 1964 school boycott? This is a personal favorite of mine.
Yeah, well, and yeah, I want you to talk about it, but clearly New York Times says it's absolutely a wrong solution. That it's not the right thing to do. You know, essentially what they're doing is something that's criminal, right? They're essentially keeping kids out of school. Right. So you wrote about this, I think, right?
Yeah, no, I've read. I think because I think in part one of the things that we imagine, in part because by 1964, you're going to see places like the New York Times taking a much more kind of critical position on Southern civil rights, right? How they're covering the sort of movement around school desegregation in Birmingham, for instance, in Alabama in 62, 63, 64, is very different than how they're covering school desegregation movements at home, right? And how they, for instance, describe Galamison, right? And they get increasingly agitated, the New York Times, about Galamison and the kind of like how unreasonable he is, how reckless he is, how they will call, for instance, they publish an editorial a couple days before the boycott. They call it violent, right? So you see this language that is a violent thing to do. So they're very kind of up in arms about it. Which is a very different kind of tone than they're taking, again, by 62, 63, 64, to how they're covering Southern struggles, right? So you're seeing a very different, this is a movement in the South. There are people who are fighting valiantly in the South, and Galamison is not of that ilk, right? Or you know, the other people in New York.
No, he's essentially a criminal, right? That's how they're portraying it, right?
Right.
You know, he's breaking the law.
Right. He's breaking the law. He doesn't care about kids. He's putting their kids at their education at risk.
Right.
And then a month later, right, as we know, white parents start to get nervous, and maybe the Board of Ed is going to take this somewhat seriously, right? The Board of Ed has floated this very modest, in the language of the time, school pairings, right? They're going to pair schools, maybe have some kids go to different schools. It's a very modest couple of dozen schools they're floating, and white parents get very nervous, right? And they march over the Brooklyn Bridge. Yeah. What kind of coverage do they get?
When I read it, was pretty positive. You know, it was sort of straight reporting without the sort of editorial notes that they did when they spoke about Galamison and the movement to integrate the New York City school system. And we're talking about tens of thousands of parents, white parents who are involved in this. And in addition to this, they are forming in Brooklyn and in Queens private schools, private academies. So this is mass resistance. And
they call themselves, their group is called, you said it before, but just to make sure people got the name of the group.
Parents and Taxpayers, right? Parents and Taxpayers.
Text for us, just to make sure we're hearing what we're.
Yeah, Parents and Tax. So they are the ones.
Or parents.
We are the parents, and we are paying the taxes.
And the other people who are parents aren't fit parents, right? They're not, right? I mean, that's the implication there too, right? That these are not fit parents. These are not real taxpayers. We are the ones.
That's right.
And
we are paying for the education of our children, right? So, so their reaction in Queens and in Brooklyn, that's where they have the largest numbers of members of that organization. They start forming what we call these academies. Now, this is in the early 60s, right? When we see this taking place. And the press doesn't label this the way they label it in the South.
Right. This is not segregationist. This is not, right?
That's right. That's right. In the South, this is mass resistance.
Right.
Right? What's taking place. Because they're defying essentially Brown v. Board of Education, right? They're not doing that in the North, even though the schools are thoroughly segregated, right?
Right.
You know, and so when the parents come out and start organizing, you know, they just report on, look, this is what's taking place here, without the editorializing. But it's mass resistance, like it was in the South.
Absolutely. And then obviously this is something that I've written about, right? So then we see that spring, what's happening in DC, right, is they're debating, and this is the spring of the debates around the Civil Rights Act, right? And one of the things that the Civil Rights Act is going to do is going to tie federal funding for schools to school desegregation. And what you see is the kind of northern sponsors like Brooklyn Congressman Emanuel Seller get nervous, right? That this could mean that it's going to come home to New York. And so they put a loophole into the Civil Rights Act, right, in terms of how they define what desegregation is and what it is not, right? And so they put into the Civil Rights Act that passes, desegregation shall not mean reassigning students, and then they use the word that Northerners prefer to talk about their schools. They say racially imbalanced schools, right? That you will have to reassign students who are going to racially imbalanced schools. So effectively, they put a loophole in that's going to protect, right, New York, Chicago, Boston, and it does, right? Chicago parents try to sue the next year and they lose because this loophole basically allows the Chicago Board of Ed, similar to how it will with Boston, to wiggle out of the ostensible strictures that the Civil Rights Act is putting in terms of you have to desegregate to get these federal dollars, right? So there's this active, proactive, and I think this is not the way we tend to think about these, you know, the heroes who bring us the Civil Rights Act, is that at the same time, and it's obvious at the time, right? Southerners are very angry at the double standard of this, right? That, you know, Eastland saying these New Yorkers are pretty good segregationists, right? But
Right.
that's not the way we think about the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
So I guess we have probably time for one more question. And so this is not, I mean, when I ask my students, well, I'm sure when you asked your students, like, did they learn anything about the history of sort of New York's civil rights movement? And again, both Clarence and I teach in New York City, right? Mm-hmm. They would say no. Right. What do you think are the costs of that? And what do you think would change if we actually reckoned with not just a history? Because again, the Southern Civil Rights Movement now occupies a big place in both the American imagination, but also in kind of, you know, elementary to high school curriculum. Like, what would it mean to then put New York City's history alongside that?
Well, it would change the narrative, that's for sure. The dominant narrative that this is the civil rights movement is a movement of triumph, right? It's a movement that eradicated Jim Crow. Yeah, we passed the most progressive legislation of that period, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and that's true. And so people walk away feeling good about themselves and feeling good about American history without looking at the sort of entire story. So when you add New York and Boston and Chicago into the story, it's not a story of triumph, right? It's essentially, we see this massive resistance, much more effective I should say,
Right.
in the North than the South. And uh, the folks who are fighting more integration, they lose the battle for the most part.
Right.
And the loss of this battle tells us, well, first of all, racism is alive and well throughout the United States, not just in the South, but also in northern urban centers, right? The most ones that are being portrayed as these paragons of integration and cultural diversity and so on and so forth. So yeah, it sort of really changes, makes people sort of think about this struggle for racial equality that we have to sort of continue today, because it didn't end with the passage of the '64 Civil Rights Act or the passage of the Voting Rights Act, with many neoconservatives and others say that's when it really, America really accomplished something. The civil rights movement accomplished its goal, right? As they argue. And instead, then they also argue what's taking place now is something different from civil rights, because this is we're in a sort of post-civil rights era.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is culture, not structural inequality, not racism.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if we include this story, we will come up with a sort of different picture of what's really going on, and it continues to go on, because the civil rights struggle hasn't ended, right? It's so clear to us today, to a lot of us, right?
Right. And then I think people try to draw these like really problematic distinctions between like the good civil rights movement of the 1960s and then this kind of Black Lives Matter, where they're not using the right tactics, and couldn't they just be like more like Martin Luther King?
Yes.
And you're like, and like when people first started saying that, I was like, wait, be careful what you wish for, man. Like, but also I think it erases. So I've gotten, like interested in like, King's talking about the problems of Northern liberalism. King's talking about police brutality in New York. He comes in '64. He tries to say to Wagner invites King to the city, right? But then when King says, you need a CCRB, Wagner's like, basically.
Yeah. In the conversation.
Exactly. And I think what you're saying about Galamison too, right? When we look at the ways that Northern activists are treated in the 60s when they're raising these questions, then the ways that people today are often portrayed as you're being unreasonable, you're the problem, you're the criminal. I don't know, just like when you were describing Galamison, it just felt so resonant to the ways that activists are sometimes described today.
Yes. And I go back, to the PBA narrative, right? So, I mean, that's one that that is so glaring, so obvious, that anytime you want to challenge power, you have to portray the other side as dangerous, out of control. And clearly the people who are out of control are these racial arsonists. So it can go with policing, it can go with the whole struggle to integrate schools, with housing and so on and so forth. And so you keep telling that story, and it resonates with a lot of people. I said to someone about the upcoming election that in many ways this is going to be a test for white Americans. Because obviously the guy in the White House is a white supremacist. He's made that clear on several occasions. So how are you going to vote? Right? Well, what do you stand up for equality and what's taking place, of racial injustice, or do you side with this guy? And that, I think that's going to be a test.
Right. So I think we're at time, like this is, we're going to have to conclude our conversation. Thank you so much, Clarence. Thank you to the Brooklyn Book Festival, to the Brooklyn Historical Society, that's now called the Center for the Study of Brooklyn, History of Brooklyn. Anyways, thank you for having us. Again, we're sorry that Brian Purnell couldn't be with us. But please also buy Brian's book, Fighting Jim Crow in the County of Kings. Again, let me just stress again, buying Clarence's book, Fight the Power, African Americans in the Long History of Police Brutality in New York City. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been wonderful.